So for this tutorial, I am going to be using a 4mm crochet hook and super bulky yarn. I also expect you to know how to chain and do a double crochet. So to start, I'm just going to make a magic ring, so creating an X over my pointer finger, taking my crochet hook, going under the top right hand corner of the X and pulling the top left corner of the X through, twisting, and then I am going to chain 3, and this is how we're going to start off. And this chain 3 is going to count as our first double crochet. Now I'm just tightening the magic ring, and then now I'm going to work 2 double crochets into the magic ring. So yarning over, inserting my hook, pulling through, so then there are 3 loops on the hook, yarning over, pulling through 2 loops, and yarning over and pulling through the last 2. So I'll do that again. Yarn over, insert, yarn over, pull through, yarn over, pull through 2 loops, yarn over and pull through the last 2 loops. So we have 3 double crochets, and then we are going to chain 2. And then we're going to repeat that and do another 3 double crochets. So these 3 double crochets are going to count as a granny stitch cluster, and that's how I'm going to refer to them going forward. So once you have completed that, you can pull on the short tail left over from the magic ring, and when you pull tight on it, you should see you have a triangle shape formed. And this will be the top edge and then the bottom 2 edges. And now we are going to start on row 2, so chain 3, and this will count as our first double crochet. And then you are going to chain another 2 for the gap, so you will have a total of 5 chains. And then in that space from the previous row, the chain 2 gap, we are going to work a granny stitch cluster. So 3 double crochets. And then you are going to chain 2, and in that same spot you are going to work another granny stitch cluster. This will be the bottom corner of the bandana. And then you are going to chain another 2, and then in the 3rd double crochet from the previous row, you are going to work a double crochet into it. And that is the end of row 2. Once again, you should have this triangle shape forming. And now getting started on row 3, we're once again going to chain 3 to start the row, and this will be our first double crochet. And then in that gap from the previous row, we are going to work another 2 double crochets for a granny stitch cluster. And then we are going to chain 2, and then in that gap, in that chain 2 gap, we are going to work another granny stitch cluster. And because this is the corner, we are going to chain 2, and in that same spot, we are going to work another granny stitch cluster. Then once that's done, you're going to chain 2, and in that gap, the chain 2 gap from the previous row, you are going to work another granny stitch cluster. And that is the end of row 3. Then similarly to row 2, we are going to chain 3, and this will be our first double crochet, chain another 2 for the gap, and then in the chain 2 gap from the previous row, we are going to work a granny stitch cluster, chain another 2, and in the corner chain 2 gap, we are going to work a granny stitch cluster, chain 2, and then in that same spot, work another granny stitch cluster. and then chain 2, In the next gap, another granny stitch cluster, and then chain 2, and then once again in the third double crochet you are just going to work from the previous row, you are going to work a double crochet. Then for the next row, chain 3, and similarly to row 3, you are going to work another 2 double crochets into the chain 2 gap, so then you can finish off your first granny stitch cluster, chain 2, in the next gap, work another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, and then in that corner gap you are going to work a granny stitch cluster, chain 2, then in the same spot work another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, the next gap another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, and then in the last gap of the row we're going to work one last granny stitch cluster. Then getting started onto the next row, chain 3 again to start, so this can be your first double crochet, chain another 2 for the chain 2 gap, and then in the next gap you're going to work a granny stitch cluster, chain 2, the next gap another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, then in the corner gap you are going to work a granny stitch cluster, chain 2, and then in the same spot work another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, in the next gap another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, another granny stitch cluster in the next gap, chain 2, and then in the third double crochet from the previous row we're going to work another double crochet into it to finish off the row. And then getting started on the next row, chain 3 for the first double crochet, and then in that chain 2 gap work another 2 double crochets to finish off the granny stitch cluster, chain 2, in the next gap work another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, the next gap another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, and then in the corner gap you are going to work a granny stitch cluster, chain 2, and then in that same spot work another granny stitch cluster. Chain 2, then in the next gap you are going to work a granny stitch cluster, chain 2, in the next gap another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, then in the last gap one more granny stitch cluster. You should see your triangle continue to grow, and getting started on the next row, do another chain 3. This counts as the first double crochet, so then do another chain 2 for the chain 2 gap. Then in the next gap you're going to work a granny stitch cluster, chain 2, the next gap another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, another granny stitch cluster in the next gap, chain 2, and then in the corner gap you are going to work a granny stitch cluster, chain 2, and in the same spot work another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, and then in the next gap another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, the next gap another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, the next gap another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, and then in the third double crochet from the previous row work another double crochet. And then this will be my last demo row. You are going to chain 3, this will be the first double crochet. In the gap you are going to work 2 double crochets into it, chain 2, and then in the next gap work another 3 double crochets, chain 2, in the next gap work another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, the next gap another granny stitch cluster, chain 2, and now that we are on the corner gap you are going to work a granny stitch cluster into it, and then you're going to chain 2, and in the same spot you are going to work another granny stitch cluster. So beyond this you are going to continue this pattern of doing a row starting off with a granny stitch cluster, and then the next row starting off with the chain 5, so 3 chains for a double crochet and 2 chains for the chain 2 gap. I am going to continue until I reach a total of 17 rows. You may choose to do more or less than this depending on the gauge that you have. I just recommend that you end off on a row that finishes with the granny stitch cluster. So as you can see, this is what my work looks like after the 17 rows. You can see my last row was done with finishing off with the granny stitch cluster. And now we are going to get straight into the tie-offs for the bandana as well as the ribbed edge. So for the tie-off, you are going to chain a total of 51. You may choose to do more or less than this depending once again on the gauge that you are using, but just chain to a length that you feel would comfortably tie the bandana around your head. And then once you've completed this, in the second chain from your hook, you are going to do a slip stitch. And then after that, down the rest of the chain, in every single chain that you made, you are going to work a slip stitch to finish off the ties. So once you've completed that, you are just going to slip stitch back into the third double crochet of your last granny stitch cluster, and that should be one of your ties completed. And now we are going to get started on the ribbed detailing along the top of the bandana. So you're going to skip the granny square cluster that from your most recent row, and then in that gap from the row before that, so for me row 16, you're going to work 5 double crochets into that spot. And then once you've completed that, you are going to skip a row, and then in the next gap you are going to do a slip stitch, skip a row, and then into the next gap work another 5 double crochets, and then once again skip a row, and then in the opening do a slip stitch. And then that is going to create that scalloped or ribbed edge that we are looking for. And you're just going to continue this process across until you get to the other corner. And then for the center gap, it's a bit difficult. That will be the magic ring that we originally started with. And for me, I will be working my 5 double crochets into that magic ring. Then I will slip stitch into the next gap, 5 double crochets into the following gap, and so on until I get to the corner. So for the corner, it may be a bit confusing. So after you do your last 5 double crochets, instead of slip stitching into a gap, you are going to slip stitch into the double crochet on the corner, to the first double crochet on the corner. And then once you've done that, you are just going to do another tie, which is chaining 51, and then starting in the second chain from the hook, slip stitching down. And then once you've completed that, slip stitching into the first double crochet to finish off the tie. And then we're going to get right back into making the scalloped or ribbed edge. So into the next opening, you are just going to work 5 double crochets, and then the next opening do a slip stitch and continue as we did with the top of the bandana. Once you get to the corner gap, instead of working just 5 double crochets into it, you're going to work a total of 10 double crochets in. And then once you finish that, in the next gap going along the other edge of the bandana, you're going to slip stitch, and then into the next gap another 5 double crochets, and continuing that process until we get to our starting corner. So here I am just finishing up my last 5 double crochets, and then I'm just slip stitching into the same spot where I slip stitched to finish off my first tassel, and then cutting my excess yarn and pulling through to secure a knot. And now you can just take a darning needle, attach the short tail to the needle, and then we're just going to weave in our ends. I'm choosing to weave this end through the tie of the bandana. So just weaving it back and forth between the stitches, pulling through and then cutting off the excess. And then with the tail left over from the magic ring, once again attaching it to the needle. And then I am just going to weave it in between these stitches that I made for the scalloped or ribbed edge of the bandana. Once again, weaving it through, and then trimming off the excess. So this is what your bandana should look like. This is such a fun and easy tutorial. If you'd like the PDF version of this pattern, please check out the description for more details. If you have any questions regarding the pattern, please leave them in the comment section below. Be sure to subscribe for more content like this. Please give this video a like. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.